The Gospel of Luke makes a point of making sure that we know that Jesus died alone. All of Jesus' acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance. At a distance. And from the relative safety of that separation, I suspect that they saw how Jesus was taunted and mocked. They saw how he bled. They watched as he flailed in agony, how he fought for every last breath. Perhaps even in the separation, they were still close enough to hear Jesus call out to the God who would not answer him back. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And if they were close enough to hear that, then maybe they were even close enough to hear the centurion, the officer over the Roman guard, who saw what they saw and who said what they and everybody else already knew. Certainly, this man was innocent. But it was too late for innocence. It was too late for intervention. It was too late to protest. It was too late for anyone to come to his aid. It was too late for everything except regret. And perhaps it was regret that drove Joseph of Arimathea to risk his life, his reputation, his everything by going to the Roman governor to ask for Jesus' body. It must have seemed a fool's errand, because the Romans did not give up their dead. That was part of the torture. Typically, those who were executed stayed on their crosses for days and weeks following execution. It was not enough that your friends could do nothing but watch you die. It was not enough that the humiliating slow-motion agony of crucifixion was the most horrible death the Romans could imagine. It wasn't enough that such a display brought out the worst in human nature. Death became entertainment, and the sounds that carried you out of this life were the jeers of the useless and the weak, as they attempted with insults and false bravado to stuff down the dread, the gnawing unease, the ever-present vulnerability that came with knowing that in a world like that, the next time, at any time, it could be you up there, twisting on that cross. This was how the empire snarled, "Don't mess with us." This was how the Romans said, "Don't you even think about trying to challenge the power of Caesar. We will break you. We will desecrate your body. Your mother will have to watch. And no one with any sense will stand by you. We will break you." And when death is designed to intimidate, then grief becomes resistance. When death is a tool of intimidation and terror, grief is a form of resistance. And so these women who had followed Jesus for 3 years, these women stood their ground. Of course, saying these women stood their ground makes what they did sound more calculated than it probably was. Because I know you know that grief is just what you do. Grief is what you do when someone you loved and when something you believed in has died. You sit down next to the body and bawl. You hold on to whatever you can, begging the universe for more time. And when there just is no more time, then you do what you can to prepare your loved one for burial. You try your best to say goodbye. You wonder how you'll ever live another day. And then you cry all over again. Over the years that I've been your pastor, I have seen a lot of death. I've stood with families in hospital rooms and in living rooms that had become de facto hospice care centers. I have held a lot of cooling hands, the hands of those who have just gone on. And while death is one of the most basic, universal, and unavoidable facts of human life, I gotta say, it is still puzzling to me just quite how this transpires. It's like 1 minute, weak as they are, the one that you loved is there. And then they're gone. The body is still right there. It looks just like them. And yet, in death, their body is utterly unlike them in its stillness. It's that unearthly stillness. Where has their energy gone? Where is the spark, the will, the memories, the sense of humor, whatever it was that made them who they are? Whatever it was that they so obviously had when they were alive just evaporates. The Old Testament writers called that thing that they once had ruach. You got to say it with phlegm. Ruach. The New Testament witnesses called it pneuma, like pneumonia. Either way, it meant breath, wind, soul, spirit. But by whatever name, that animating spark that makes them who they are just goes. 1 minute it's there and then it's not. And I know as I read this scripture from the Gospel of Luke, I know that must have been how it was for these women who saw how Jesus died. They saw how his body went limp on the cross. They saw how his body just slumped over good Joseph's shoulders as he took Jesus down from there. They saw how Jesus carried what was left, how Joseph carried what was left of their Lord to a new tomb, and how Joseph wrapped the body in linen and laid it out in the grave. They saw also how the sun's light was fading and how the Sabbath was about to begin, and so they went home. They went home to weep and to mix spices with oil and to wait. To wait until they could wage insurrection by giving Jesus a proper burial. And that's how the 23rd chapter of Luke ends. It ends in darkness It ends with tears. It ends with Jesus laid out in a borrowed grave. It ends with his followers crushed and despairing. And there is absolutely nothing about that story that suggests that there is going to be a happy ending. There's nothing in this narrative that even hints at resurrection. And that is important for me to say, because over the years, an awful lot of people have tried to domesticate the resurrection. They've tried to water it down by intermingling it with the metaphors of springtime. I guess that's what happens in the Northern Hemisphere when Passover falls right after the equinox. We intermingle it with images of butterflies emerging from the chrysalis and the crocus poking its head up through the snow. We keep trying to turn this terrifying, miraculous, unexpected thing into something cyclical, something predictable, something tame. But I'm sorry, Simba, this just is not the circle of life. It's not. To quote religion scholar Barbara Brown Taylor, quote, "Resurrection is completely unnatural. When a human being goes into the ground, that's it. You do not wait around for the person to reappear so you can pick up where you left off. Not on this side of the grave anyway. You say goodbye, you pay your respects, and you go on with your life as best as you can, knowing that the only place springtime happens in a cemetery is on top of the graves and not inside them." But that defiant little conjecture, but is the very first word in the Gospel of Luke's account of our Lord's resurrection. But on the first day, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb. Jesus had just had the life crushed out of him. The best, the brightest, the most prominent and trusted people in Jerusalem, the priests, the elders, the leaders of the people, they'd done their worst to him. The story is a tragedy. It's a nightmare, but Luke begins the story of Easter with that tenacious, insubordinate little word, "But on the first day of the week they came." And then that word shows up again. It shows up again in verse 2. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. And then it shows up twice more in verse 5. The women were terrified. They bowed their faces to the ground, but the men, who Luke intends for us to understand are angels, but the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen." It's the Easter proclamation. It's the very heart of the Christian message. He is not here. Well, you got the punchline. You didn't get the but. That's the fun part. We'll try again. He is not here, but he has risen. Yes, it's the life-altering, world-changing truth that Jesus Christ is not in his tomb. He has been raised. There will be no funeral. The spices will have to wait. Death will not have the final word. Despite all that was done to him, the grave cannot keep him. The worst the world could do was not enough then, and it never will be again. He is not here. He is not dead. He is not defeated. He has risen. The resurrection is God's resounding answer to the worst that the world can dish out. The resurrection is God's vindication of the one who suffered for the sake of you and me. Christ's resurrection means that death is not the end. There is more to us than just our years on this earth. There is more to this life than just this life. The story of Jesus does not end in weeping. It ends with a great big but. He is not here, but He is risen. Remember what He said. Remember how He told you. Those are the angel's next words, which is instructive to us. 3 times in the Gospel of Luke, 3 times before He ever got close to Jerusalem, 3 times Jesus told His disciples that He would be betrayed, arrested, humiliated, beaten, killed, but on the 3rd day He would rise. And given that Jesus had said these things repeatedly, not just once, He said them 3 times, you might think that His followers would remember this without prompting. You might think that they could recall something like this on their own. But no. Now, before we get all high and mighty about how inattentive those early disciples must have been, I just want us to recall that all learning is contextual. All learning is contextual. All learning takes place within a specific context. And you can have all the information in the world, but until you have the experience, until you see the application, the information alone just doesn't mean much. And so while the women cowered in that dark tomb, the heavenly messengers did their level best to give these heartbroken disciples a new context. They say, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. But, and this is so important. This is so important. Thomas Wardlaw, who teaches at Austin Seminary, says that the reason the Gospel of Luke is so persistent with that little word, but, is because Luke was very well aware that the world is telling a different story, a compelling half-gospel. Rather, a competing half-gospel, a lie that ends on Good Friday. And that fable that the world tells goes like this: nothing good ever lasts. Might always makes right. The powerful will always exploit the weak. You can't win. And so it's best not to try. That competing half-gospel says you live your life and then you die and that's it. It says that one person cannot change the world. And so it's better to go home and get yours where you can. The story the world tells insists that avoiding death as long as possible is the same as living. The story the world tells is that corpses do not rise, that nothing survives our dying except questions and ever-fading memories, that nobody else is going to look out for you. And so you have to do that for yourself. That's the story the world is selling. It's cynical, it's hostile, it's brutal, selfish, and it thrives. It gorges itself on the gloomy passivity that it spawns. It's a story that scorns faith as it seeks to replace hope with premature certainties about the way things are and will always be. But we have another story. We have another story. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, we know that death is strong, but love is stronger. We know that Jesus lives and Jesus is Lord over life, over death, over life beyond death. We have a gospel that does not end on Good Friday, that does not endorse violence, that does not end in despair, that does not conclude with a tomb and a funeral. He is not here, but He is risen. Easter is God's great yes. Yes to Jesus, yes to life, yes to the redeemed creation, yes to a lifetime of second chances, a yes to all of us. The world may insist that its half gospel is true, but we know the rest of that story. Jesus is alive and at work, and because He lives, we will live as well. The cross was not the end of His story. Death was not His final chapter. The darkness could not keep Him. The grave could not restrain Him. And good news, if it was true for Him, it can be true for you too. God already raised Him up. Now it's time for God to get working on you. You guys look awfully passive for this kind of news. The good news of Easter is that none of our hopelessness, none of our despair, no human agony is beyond God's reach. No doubt, some of you here this morning are hoping this news is true, but no doubt some of you have not yet experienced it for yourself. You have not yet had your change of context. And so the news just doesn't register yet. Perhaps it is because you feel hopeless about your future. Perhaps you are feeling numb to life and believe that you are powerless to do anything to change your circumstances. Maybe an addiction has a death grip on you, and no matter how much willpower you try to stir up, it's never enough. Or maybe it's a relationship or the lack of one that has you wandering among the gravestones. Maybe someone has rejected you and led you to believe that you have nothing to offer. Maybe you are so deeply in debt that you cannot crawl out. Maybe you are so tired of failing in your family or in your career that you can hardly start over again. The maybes pile up like gravestones, but I want you to know that there is good news for you too. The promise of Easter is that everything we think is hopeless is not. It is not. The promise of Easter is that every door that has been slammed shut can swing open again. The promise of Easter is that every heart that is too bitter and too cold and too far gone to touch can be healed. The promise of Easter is that the way things are now is not the way they're always gonna be. The promise of Easter is that violence, sin, and death will never have the last word. God's not letting that happen. He is not here, but He is risen. 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 And the God who did that for Him is planning amazing things for you.